This week we're going to be looking at the genre of the short story from the mid-century era, and we'll start with The Swimmer. And The Swimmer is written by John Cheever, and there's a couple different versions I've given you, so you can read it here, or you can listen to the author read it. Or if you're interested on YouTube, there's other instances where people can read it and then they've put like pictures with it. So it's up to you to kind of find a version that you'd like to read or listen to. It's a short story, so it takes about 20 minutes to read. Um, and then I I think that it might be confusing. Like, okay, what I don't get it. The premise is that there's a guy and he is about 8 miles from home and he decides he's going to swim home. The problem is he's in the middle of a suburb. And so you might think, well, how is he going to swim home if he's in the middle of a suburb? Well, he decides to swim by way of every single neighbor's swimming pool in order to get back to his house. Um, and it becomes this really interesting process at first where you're just like, okay, he's going from pool to pool, but then weird things start happening where he realizes that this one set of neighbors that shouldn't be gone, like their house is empty, and then he notices like other people make comments to him such as like, "Hey, I thought you guys had moved out," or "Oh, I'm so sorry for what happened." And he starts to feel like he doesn't understand what they're talking about. And by the time he gets home, he realizes that way more time has passed than just an afternoon. And so it really spans the scope of his lifetime as a young man, all the way until kind of middle age and older. And so each encounter that he has along the way and each person that he meets um, has some type of symbolic value or significance. And we call this in literature an epic. So, an epic, in its most specific sense, is a genre of classical poetry, and it originated in Greece. So, if you read the Odyssey or the Iliad, in hopefully you would have read that in ninth grade. Um, and what happened is that over time, authors took a lot of liberty with this particular genre. And so rather than being steeped only in Greek poetry, it had a lot more application in the current setting. And so I wanted to go through the elements of an epic with you to see how it has been adapted for sort of a modern clientele in the 1960s. So just to go through these numbers, an epic is a long narrative about a serious or worthy traditional subject. So in this case, you're going to see that for the 1960s, everything was pared down from being very serious and very significant to kind of being like meh or hmm. It's kind of in the same way that the Lost Generation had sort of that attitude of malaise or a laissez-faire attitude where because of the war, because of all the death that they'd seen, because of what they had experienced in the older generation that had come back from World War II and the Vietnam War, there was sort of this sense of just, I don't know what matters. And they were rethinking life all over again. So even though he's just going home and that's his journey, I think that was the serious trial and pursuit that was faced by our main character, Ned. Okay, so it's also, the diction is elevated in style. It employs a formal, dignified, objective tone and many figures of speech. So there's going to be a lot of alliteration and simile and metaphor, things that you can read into and symbolic language. So go ahead and look for that as you're reading through. Part C, the narrative focuses on the exploits of a hero or a demigod who represents the cultural values of a race, nation, or a religious group. So even though Ned is, he's kind of like the anti-hero because he is in literature what they would call the everyman. Just kind of he is meant to symbolize what the average human being would have been or experienced. And so he's heroic in that sense because, again, with the 1960s, it's paring it down from we don't believe in heroes anymore. They called us heroes when we went off to war, and guess what? People got shot. And so there's this sort of like anti-hero mentality. I just want to be average and drown my sorrows in lots of drinking and affairs and that sort of thing. And that's what we're going to see as his story progresses. But I do, and part of your homework question is going to be to look at how he, Ned, represents the cultural values of that particular race, nation, and religious group. Part D is that his success or failure determines the fate of that people or nation. So is he ultimately successful in his journey? Does he make it home? Yes. But what happens at the end? Does he make it home to his wife and his family and it was a good afternoon? Oh, a good game. No. In the end, you see that his quest is not successful. He makes it home, but his house is empty, his family is gone, and he has no idea who he is. And so it was a failed journey, which talks about the fate of the people or nation in that mid-century time period ultimately would fail. The action takes place in a vast setting and covers a wide geographic area. The setting is frequently sometime in the remote past. So again, he goes through an 8 mile radius of the suburbs, and I think that's like a tongue-in-cheek reference that, oh, it's so far. Like people just kind of stay in their suburbs. They don't really go beyond their white picket fences. And so, yes, it is intended to symbolize something that's much more expansive than just a temporary setting. Um, let's see, moving quickly through these. The action contains superhuman feats of strength and military prowess. Again, think of that pared down. Gods or supernatural beings frequently take part in the action to affect the outcome. And this would be like the other people that he meets along the way as they help him in his journey. And the poem begins with the invocation of a muse to inspire the poet, a prayer to an appropriate supernatural being. The speaker asks that his being provide him with a suitable emotion, creativity, or words to finish the poem. And so this is sort of like he gets his quest or his journey at the beginning, and it doesn't come from a god or a demigod. It comes from himself, his own desire to amuse himself. And again, that is a comment on the fact that people had become their own gods at this point. They had rejected the supernatural. The narrative starts in media res, so it's in the middle of the action. Subsequently, the earlier events leading up to the poem will be recounted in the narratives or in the flashbacks. So we don't quite know why he is hanging out at the pool this one particular afternoon until the story unfolds. So it begins in the middle of the action. The epic contains long catalogs of heroes or important characters, focusing on highborn kings and great warriors rather than on peasants and commoners. And we're going to see that if you were to pay particular attention to each of the couples that he encounters and what their story is, you're going to see that these are wealthy couples. This is intended to be a critique on middle to upper class America and the outcomes of their lives and the values that they hold. Finally, the epic employs extended similes. They're called epic similes at appropriate spots of the story, a traditional scene of extended description in which the hero arms himself. So the entire thing is an extended metaphor to symbolize the life that he lived. And you have to wait till tomorrow's video to get into how critics and scholars have interpreted the metaphor that is this poem. But for now, just enjoy the interesting kind of quirky story that is a literary epic. And I want you to note how this reflects on the cultural values and the success or failure of the ventures that this society attempted and whether or not it was worthy.